are to approve the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? Seeing none, the agenda is approved. The second item is approval of the proceedings from February 2014. It has been a while for this board. Any changes to the proceedings? Seeing none, that's approved. Item number 3, public comment. We have not had anybody sign up to comment. Would anybody from the public like to make a comment on an item not on the agenda? Seeing none, we will now move on to item number 4, which is an update on the 2017 benchmark assessment that Katie Drew will be giving us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll keep this quick. We are still on track for a review in early 2017. We are in the process of finalizing the data from all the states for a terminal year of 2015 in the assessment. We've been pretty lucky in getting the acoustic tagging data together. We still have some sources to track down, but for the most part, people have been very cooperative in providing that data, which we look forward to using. We've had to switch assessment modelers for the tagging model, but the new person who hopefully will be approved today as the next agenda item is very well qualified and experienced with this kinds of tagging model and is coming up to speed quickly on that front. We're also in the process of having those acoustically tagged fish genetically analyzed so that we can assign them to a DPS and hopefully get down to a more fine-scale estimate of mortality from that model. Excuse me. So basically everything is under control, and we're still on track for a 2017 assessment review. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Any questions for Katie? Oh, yes, Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've heard there's been some concerns about accessing the genetics data. How is that going to play against getting the stock assessment completed on time? Is that going to cause any? Do you have any concerns with that impacting the schedule for completion? Not excessive concerns on that front. I think really the only impact would potentially be a reduction in the sample size of fish that we could actually assign to a DPS. So if for some analyses. So I think that we're working on trying to, there's also, there's limitations in terms of money and actual sample availability, but I think we'll be able to get the vast majority of available samples analyzed and included in the assessment, and it should not delay the assessment in that regards.
Thank you, Katie. Are there any other questions for Katie? Seeing none, we move on to agenda item 5, which is review and populate the stock assessment subcommittee membership, and I'll turn that over to Max.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As Katie alluded to, there are 2 stock assessment subcommittee memberships that need board approval. That's for Jared Flowers and David Kazak. First, Jared, he's a recent hire at North Carolina DMF. He's done some extensive work with sturgeon and other anadromous species in the U.S. And as Katie mentioned, he is a very qualified and experienced candidate to head the tagging model portion of the assessment, which was formerly headed by Will Smith, who recently left North Carolina and is no longer a member on the stock assessment subcommittee. The other member nominee is David Kazak, who's a postdoc with the USGS, and a lot of his recent work has been focused on estimating census population size of the Hudson River Atlantic sturgeon population, which is part of the objective of the stock assessment. So the SAS, the stock assessment subcommittee, intends to incorporate David's work into the assessment and kind of avoid any duplicate efforts to do that part. Also, he has some experience with genetics data and analysis, and this is a big plus for the stock assessment subcommittee, since the majority of those members are somewhat unfamiliar with those kind of data sets. So again, just looking for board approval here for Jared Flowers and David to the sturgeon SAS. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Max. We'll need a motion. Can I have a motion, Dr. Daniel?
Motion to approve Jared Flowers and David Kazak as members of the stock assessment subcommittee.
Second by Bill Adler. Is there any objection to these? Seeing none, the motion passes unanimously, and they are both on the stock assessment subcommittee. Thank you. Okay, the next item on our agenda is an overview of NOAA Fisheries Critical Habitat Designation process for Atlantic sturgeon, and I will turn it over to Kim Damon Randall of NOAA, and she's in the back of the room there, right? Thank you, Kim.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about process, the critical habitat designation process, just because I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with it. So we can go to the next slide. So under the ESA, the Secretary of either Commerce or Interior has to designate critical habitat based on the best available information, but they also have to consider whether or not the benefits of including critical habitat outweigh the economic impacts, the impacts of national security, and other relevant impacts when they're specifying areas as particular habitat. So this is a little bit different than listing, where economics doesn't factor into the listing decision. And areas can be excluded from critical habitat designation if the benefits of excluding outweigh the benefits of including them, as long as it doesn't result in the extinction of the species. So next slide. So Section 4B6C requires the final regulation designating critical habitat of a listed species be published concurrently with the final listing determination, if prudent and determinable. If it's not determinable at the time of listing, it can be extended 1 year, but not more than 1 year. Just as a reminder, the final listing for the 5 Atlantic sturgeon DPSs was in February 2012, so it's over that 1 year time frame that we are allotted under the ESA. So critical habitat is defined as the specific areas within the geographical area occupied by the species at the time that it's listed, on which are found those physical or biological features that are essential to the conservation of the species and that may require special management consideration or protection. And also it can include specific areas that are outside the geographic area occupied by the species at the time it's listed, if it's determined that those areas are essential for the conservation of the species. So the Secretary shall designate all lands owned or controlled by the Department of Defense, shall not designate, that's an important word, not, all lands that are owned or controlled by the Department of Defense if they have an integrated natural resources management plan that's been determined to provide benefits for the species for which the critical habitat may have been proposed. So we can exclude DOD lands if the in-ramp is protective enough of the listed species and the habitat. So in the process, we have to first identify the areas that meet the definition of critical habitat, and then we have to do the Section 4B2 analysis, which allows us to consider those impacts and balance the benefits versus the adverse impacts of either including or excluding critical habitat in the designation. Next slide. So the first thing that we have to do is determine the geographical area that's occupied by the species. So for Atlantic sturgeon, that's a very wide geographical area that extends from Canada to Florida. Then we have to look at what the physical and biological features are that are essential to the conservation of the species. And then we have to determine whether any features may require special management considerations or protections. And then we delineate the specific areas that contain those essential features, and we determine whether or not there are any unoccupied areas that are essential for the conservation of the species. So the next step is to do the Section 4B2 analysis. So we consider the economic or other impacts of designating any particular areas as critical habitat. We need to weigh the benefits of excluding a particular area against the benefits of including it. We have to look at whether or not there are conservation plans or partnerships, whether or not there's tribal lands, national security and homeland security impacts, and also military lands, and look at the economic impacts of what would happen if that habitat was designated. Then we determine, can you go back, please? Then we determine whether any particular areas should be excluded from critical habitat. And areas can, again, as I said earlier, be excluded as long as the failure to include them does not result in the extinction of the species. So who's affected by critical habitat? The key benefit of designating critical habitat is to put other federal agencies on notice that they must consult with NOAA Fisheries if they intend to authorize, fund, or carry out an action that may affect the critical habitat of a species listed under the ESA. In these situations, we would provide guidance as to how the action can be carried out in a manner that avoids or minimizes impacts to critical habitat. So it's very focused on federal actions. So for Atlantic sturgeon, some of you may have known that we were sued to designate critical habitat because we were past that statutory deadline. We entered into a settlement agreement with the Natural Resources Defense Council and Delaware Riverkeeper that we would file our proposed rules in the Federal Register by November 30th of 2015. And we actually went back to the court and asked for a deadline, an extension to that deadline. So it's been extended to May 27th, 2016. We've gathered the biological information into biological source documents that form the basis for the designation. New information for a couple of rivers in the southeast was provided by the peer reviewers. We did have asked the Sturgeon Technical Committee to serve as peer reviewers, and we got some very good information from them. And some of that was new, and that's being incorporated into the southeast rules, rule as they work forward on development of that rule. Our both economic analyses were peer-reviewed by economic experts, and we used the biological source document and the economic analyses to serve as the basis for the one rule that's being developed for the 3 distinct population segments in the Garfo region and one for the 2 DPSs in the southeast region. So both rules will go through the internal peer review, or the internal clearance process, rather. They will file with the Federal Register by May 27th, 2016, which means that they'll be actually published in the Federal Register a couple days after that. We've agreed to doing a 90-day public comment period. Normally it's a 60-day public comment period, but we looked at the schedule of the ASMFC meetings and knew that fell right before the August ASMFC meeting, so we decided just to go ahead and extend it for 90 days. We will host public meetings throughout the range to obtain public comment, and if it's helpful, we can come to the August ASMFC meeting, board meeting if you have one, and present on what the designations include.
Thank you, Kim. Are there any questions for Kim on this? Let's see, we have Dave Borden.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to the last point, I think it'd be very helpful to have a presentation on this at the August board meeting. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Bill Adler. Any other questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. May I ask, it seems to me that the whole coast and all the rivers could be critical habitat, and I get very worried about what that means, because I've dealt with that with the whale issue on critical habitats. So I guess maybe the Norfolk Navy base will be okay because it's military, I guess. But I just get worried about how much of this coast and rivers are actually going to be designated, and then what happens to the, for instance, the fishing industry that may be impacted there. And so I'm just cautious, and I get worried about too much critical habitat. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any response to that, Kim, or?
So I think one thing to keep in mind is any action, any federal action that's going to go through a Section 7 consultation that would look at effects to critical habitat has to impact those physical and biological features that we've identified. So we just designated a broader area of critical habitat for right whales. It's pretty much the entire Gulf of Maine in the Northeast, so a very wide geographic area. But the fishing industry does not have impacts on what those physical and biological features are for right whale critical habitat. So it's not having any impact on the fishing industry. So just keep that in mind, that it has to, whatever the action is that we're consulting on, has to affect those physical and biological features.
Thank you, Kim. Next question is from Bill Goldsboro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering how and to what extent our Habitat Committee is in loop on this. I suspect they'll be meeting at the spring meeting, but I'm not certain about that. In any case, we certainly want them in the loop. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill.
The Habitat Committee is not meeting at this spring.
The Habitat Committee is not meeting. Oh, Tony?
The Habitat Committee has their own spring meeting, so it wouldn't be at the May meeting week, but they do have a meeting, and we can work with Lisa and Kim to have a discussion, but they have not been discussing this listing yet.
Thank you, Tony. Next, we have Tom Foti.
I always love this listing of critical habitat because it affects maybe fishermen and a few other people, but when it comes to the Army Corps of Engineers and their projects like widening of the channels in every river to bring in the huge tankers that we're now destroying all the slopings and along the riverbank and everything else, they seem to get exempted. And the ports also get exempted because they can even outvote a governor's consistency ruling. So it's always, I look at this with a cynical eye, especially when you get the, I guess, part of the Department of Defense. As a former Army Corps of Engineer officer, I realize that we get exempted from things we shouldn't get exempted, like destroying the lumps off the New Jersey coast to basically put sand on beaches. So, and that's also sturgeon habitat. They're out there swimming.
Thanks. Next, I have Louis Daniel.
I stay anxious about all this, but I guess my question would be, based on history, if it would be possible for us to have an opportunity to look at and review this before it's published as a partner in sturgeon management with the National Marine Fisheries Service. That might have helped the actual listing discussion decision. So perhaps we could be involved in that before it's published in the Federal Register.
So we did ask the Sturgeon Technical Committee to review the biological information that forms the basis for the critical habitat designation. I would have to talk to our attorneys, but I think because of the way that the federal decision process is, I'm not sure we can share anything before it's published because it would be considered pre-decisional, but I can talk to our attorneys and get back to you on that.
Thank you, Kim. Are there any other questions for Kim? Okay, not seeing any. We'll move on to our next item, which is an action item. We need to elect a vice chair. Is there a motion from the floor? Marty Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to nominate Dr. Louis Daniel from the state of North Carolina to be the next vice chairman of the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission Atlantic Sturgeon Management Board.
Thank you, Marty. Pat Augustine, second.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to close nomination and cast one vote in favor of Mr. Daniel to become the new vice chair. Welcome, sir. Congratulations.
Do we have any objections? Seeing none, congratulations, Louis. You are the new vice chair. Let's see, we do not. We are already on to other business.
I got the nod to go ahead and do the FMP review.
Oh, okay. Since we are moving right along here, we're going to go ahead and do the FMP review, which was on the original agenda, and Max will take that. Thanks, Max.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll get through this pretty quickly. So, go to the next slide. As we know, there is a complete moratorium for Atlantic sturgeon since 1997, and harvest in the EEZ has been prohibited since '98. These moratoria are expected to remain in place until a minimum of 20 protected year class with spawning females can be exhibited, and that the FMP is modified at that point to permit harvest or possession. So bycatch, in 2013, a total of 288 Atlantic sturgeon were reported as bycatch in various fisheries on the Atlantic coast. 208 were reported in 2014, and majority of these were reported from the Federal Observer Program, the NEFOP data, and the South Carolina Winya Bay American Shad Gillnet fishery. Approximately 70% of the 2013 and 2014 reported bycatch. So it's also important to note, though, that it continues to be an underreporting concern regarding bycatch, and this is in part due to the ESA listing that everyone's aware of, and this has led to some states to terminate some of their voluntary logbook programs for bycatch reporting. Ship strikes continue to be a source of mortality for Atlantic sturgeon. In 2013, there were 26 sturgeon carcasses reported in the Delaware estuary, and an additional 23 reported in 2014, and this does include fish reported from Pennsylvania's portion of the Delaware River. So as we've alluded to, the current moratorium is partially in response to the 1998 assessment. And again, in 2012, after several status reviews, NMFS did publish a final rule declaring the Gulf of Maine DPS as threatened and the other 4 as endangered. So in response to this listing, the board initiated that coast-wide assessment, which is currently underway and scheduled for review in early 2017. And as Katie explained, the TC, the Stock Assessment Subcommittee, and its working groups are working very hard to see that that assessment is completed on schedule. A quick habitat highlighted that I wanted to provide for the board is that in Maine on the Penobscot River, the last of 3 dams have been removed, which blocked historical habitat since 1830. And according to some telemetry results, Maine DMR has demonstrated that Atlantic sturgeon have been using this newly available habitat for spawning. So that's good news for Maine. As part of compliance, states are required to submit information on the results of bycatch and other fisheries, any independent monitoring results, the status of habitat, and information on aquaculture operations. Also, we ask that states provide an overview of any ongoing research, and there was an extensive list of those studies included in the FMP review document that went out in supplemental materials, and there's a couple copies in the back of the room if anyone wants to look at that. After review, the plan review team found that all states and jurisdictions did meet the requirements for the Atlantic sturgeon FMP. There were a few recommendations, though, from the PRT. One is for states to continue to coordinate with the Commission regarding the progress of incidental take permits under Section 10 of the ESA. North Carolina and Georgia have received Section 10 ITPs for commercial gillnet operations. I'm aware that Rhode Island is also pursuing an ITP for their fisheries. These are the only states that I'm aware of at this point, so if a state was left out here, please get in touch with me and let me know. And that concludes the FMP review. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Max. Questions? Dr. Daniel?
Maybe a comment and a question. First, North Carolina, we do have our ITP in place. We have been doing observed trips in all the areas where we've seen sturgeon, and we've seen a lot of sturgeon, mostly juveniles. Most of the big sturgeon basically are represented by big holes in the gill nets, we think. So that's going to increase that number significantly, the 288. And it just dawned on me, I'm wondering if and Katie may be able to answer this question, if there's enough information in the observer program thus far to be of any use in the stock assessment, because that should be providing us with some, at least over time, it's going to provide us with some good CPUE and abundance information. And I don't know if you've even considered that yet, or it's probably too short a time series to use at this point.
It's a good question. We are intending to use the Federal Observer Program try to look at that as a CPUE of bycatch over time as an index of abundance, because it is a longer time series. But we'll definitely be including North Carolina and actually South Carolina's bycatch information, partly as just trying to get estimates of bycatch that we can compare to the Observer Program to kind of give us some bounds on what's being taken. We will look at it for a potential CPUE, but as you point out, the time series is really too short to have a lot of contrast to be useful in that effect, but it's definitely information that we are looking at and will incorporate into the stock assessment.
Thank you, Katie. Any more questions about the FMP review? Not seeing any. Can we get a motion to approve the FMP review? Bill Adler?
Yes, I'll make a motion to approve the FMP report.
Do we have a second? 20. Okay. And Pat Augustine seconds the motion. Okay. The motion is up. Are there any objections to this motion? Seeing none, the motion is approved. Is there any other business to come before the Sturgeon Board? Seeing none, we are adjourned. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, Roy, did you have something?
I did, Mr. Chairman, and this was not on the agenda, so I'm just proposing that this question be considered in the future. We might want to consider how to provide our fishermen in our respective jurisdictions a greater level of comfort with reporting bycatch of Atlantic sturgeon. My perception is that there's considerable reluctance to provide that kind of information for fear of running afoul of the legal system, and I'd like to explore in the future perhaps better ways to communicate that information to increase that level of comfort so that we get more accurate landing statistics. Thank you. Or not landings, but more accurate bycatch statistics. Thank you.
Thanks, Roy. Let me slow down then. Is there anything else to come before the Sturgeon Board? Now seeing none, we are adjourned. Thank you.
The Spiny Dogfish Management Board will start in 5 minutes. Thank you.